Hey, what is going on, all my fellow godlies and Warframe enthusiasts around the world? This is Vance bringing you the most requested video of all time for this page, and that is the Excalibur ReForged. Now, in truth, I could have done an Excalibur ReForged way back when they released the Chromatic Blade to the game, because it changed the game for Excalibur players. Before that, Excalibur was doing mediocre damage, and then he went up to doing great damage again. But I opted to hold off on doing a ReForged video until Umbra was released, because I accurately predicted that Umbra was going to bring some interesting mechanics to the game. So let's just jump straight into it and explain why we're using this setup. Now, this entire loadout is going to pay dividends to itself. This entire loadout, your melee, your primary, your sentinel, all of it is going to work with itself to produce some optimal results in in-game. And this setup in particular takes a lot of aspects from every Excalibur rendition that has ever existed. So from like closed beta up until Umbra released, like here we are 3 years later after the initial announcement of Excalibur Umbra, and we've got some crazy stuff to show. Growing power is going to benefit your Exalted Blade. That's why this is here. And you want to get that 25% extra damage here. It's just going to play dividends for you in-game because this whole loadout is very, very status savvy. So growing power is procced with status. So because you're doing status, you want to gain that extra 25% damage increase. Same could be said about power drift, other than the fact that I'm pretty stubborn when it comes to my Excalibur build. I like rush. I feel as though, now this may be an opinion, it requires a lot more testing, but I feel as though rush makes it so you're able to strafe when in Exalted Blade a lot better. So I don't know, maybe if you tested an Excalibur without rush versus an Excalibur with rush, you might see why I'm choosing to use rush instead of power drift. But if you don't want to use that, that's fine. This is an optional, totally optional space that you can do whatever you want with. The only mods here that I think that are utterly needed, and you would be a fool to not include, would be Chromatic Blade and Radiant Finish. Now let me explain something here. Chromatic Blade is what I previously said changed the game for Excalibur players forever. The Exalted Blade's damage type changes depending upon your energy color. So much like Chroma, hence the name Chromatic Blade, you will get fire damage from red colors, yellows, and oranges. You'll get ice from whites and blacks. You'll get electricity from your blues and purples, and then toxic from your greens. Now, I chose to use red because it aesthetically pleases me for one, but I also chose to use red because it's fire, which helps with your corrosive, because corrosive and fire, or corrosive and ice, are probably the best combination of status types that you can inflict upon your enemy. On top of that, it gives you an increased status chance of 50%, which, like I said earlier, our entire loadout is very, very status savvy. Now, Radiant Finish, this does a couple of things here. Not only is it going to open up all enemies across the board to 300% more finisher damage, but that's going to help with our melee, because our melee is able to do finishers all on its own. But what you'll need to do beforehand is just make sure that your enemies are blinded. So at the height of your combo, you're going to automatically do that finisher, and then Radiant Finish is going to ensure that you do 300% added to that devastating finisher. This doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's beautiful, and you practically one-shot anything that you're fighting, even without the effects of Exalted Blade. But Radiant Finish will help Exalted Blade, because Exalted Blade's hits count as a finisher. Why, I don't know, but they do. And I've tested this. They might change this in the future, so if they have, this build it's not rendered obsolete, but it still helps to have Radiant Finish, because with Umbra, you don't do blind anymore. You do howl, which will still blind them, but because you're fighting sentients, you will remove their immunity. So when they start to adapt to your damage and develop an immunity to it, you can strip them of that. And I think that you're going to need this mod in terms of later updates that come out, because, spoiler alert, we found out that the Lotus was a sentient, but we already knew that thanks to the second dream, Hunhow telling us so. But we actually saw it at the end, the cliffhanger of Umbra's mission, the sacrifice. So DE is kind of like insinuating that we're going to be fighting a lot of sentients in future updates. So I would definitely build for Radiant Finish and Chromatic Blade. Hunter Adrenaline is here to replace Rage because it does the additional 5% more energy given back to us upon health damage. And also set bonus. You know, companions deal 50% extra damage against enemies affected by slash damage. And guess what our weapons do? Slash damage. Both our primary weapon and our melee weapon are going to deal slash damage, therefore helping Hunter Adrenaline do its thing. Prime Flow, for obvious reasons, you definitely want to have a bigger pool of energy at your disposal for Exalted Blade. Prime Continuity to make sure that the effects of Howl or Blind, if you're using normal Excalibur, just make sure that your blind sticks to them a lot longer. And then Arcane Fury on a critical hit, 40% chance for your melee to do 120% more damage. For Arcane Strike, it's a 10% chance for 40% attack speed to melee weapons for 12 seconds. This will carry over to Exalted Blade, and it's pretty cool that it does do that. I'm not so sure about Arcane Fury, but I know for a fact about Arcane Strike, and every time you max out an Arcane, you get an Arcane Revive. So if you have both of these Arcane enhancements maxed out, you go from having 4 revives to 6. It's very, very handy in case, you know, you slipped up, you goofed up, and you got killed. There was a couple of times that I died trying to revive some teammates, because Excalibur is not so good with that, especially when you're fighting nullifiers, because you can't blind them outside of their shield, and you want to get up your allies. At that point, I would really recommend just swapping to your operator, jumping over there and going into the invisible mode, and then reviving them. That way you don't make that mistake. So I'm going to skip to my melee weapon here because I feel as though it's very, very important to Excalibur's entire setup. As I stated before, with your stance mod, which I think is the best stance in the entire game, you will do finisher damage at the height of your combo. This can be paired well with Radiant Finish if you time it just right. If you do your blind and then you do your combo, at the height of that combo, if you manage to get them at just the right hit, you will benefit from the Crimson Dervish finisher and also the Radiant Finish. It's incredible. Like I said, in most cases it one-shots pretty much anything that I'm fighting, and if we're going to compare it to something, I would compare it to Covert Lethality because it's almost just as good. You're going to want to use Prime Pressure Point, Prime Fever Strike, Shocking Touch, Prime Fury, Healing Return, so that, because I normally, if I'm in a panic situation, I'm going to be using Exalted Blade, because by the time anything has the ability to kill me, I'm going to need to stay in Exalted Blade. But for instances in which you just got a little bit of health shaved off you, like maybe you got knocked down and enemies were plowing on you for a while, Healing Return will passively give you back your health, plus 11 for each hit, just as long as they're affected by status. But because this entire loadout is so status savvy, they're always going to be affected by status. Everything in your loadout here is going to put them under the effects of status, some type of status. So you will get your health back passively for each enemy that you hit, 11 per hit. Berserker, obviously going to increase your attack speed every time you get a critical hit. Condition Overload is very, very essential to not only this build for your melee, but also to the Exalted weapon. 60% melee damage for each status type affecting the target. This is going to be paired very, very, very well with the Sentinel weapon, which I will discuss here in a minute. Drifting Contact increases your combo duration, so each time you build your combo, it increases the amount of time that the combo stays there, therefore increasing your damage over time. It also does 40% status chance, so it's really, really nice for such a loadout that has such status savvy. Now, instead of talking about the Exalted Weapon right now, I want to skip to talking about my Sentinel, because it's imperative that you build the way that I'm building. Worm Prime is the Sentinel that I've chose to use because it's the tankiest. If I were to briefly talk about this, show you the build really quickly, I don't need to discuss anything here. These mods are all the mods that you're going to want to use. I'm using it because it has the highest shield rating, 1125. This makes it probably the most tankiest Sentinel in the game. Now, the reason why you want to have your Sentinel survive at all points in the game is because of the starter weapon R-Tax. Now, Sweeper Prime is the weapon that you get from Worm Prime. R-Tax comes from the starter Sentinel, and you might be wondering, why would we use such a shitty weapon on such an amazing Sentinel? Now, it's because R-Tax, even though it says it only has a 10% status chance, it will affect enemies with status, with every hit, universally. I don't know why that is. I have no idea why it says 10% status, but it goes ahead and affects every enemy with each hit a status. Like it's mind-boggling to me. But because every hit is going to put them under the effects of status, we're going to benefit from viral and radiation. Now, I discussed this with Condition Overload. Because we're using Condition Overload for both our melee and our Exalted Blade, this is going to make it so you have fire, corrosive, viral, and radiation. That's, if we go back to Condition Overload, it's 60% melee damage per status effect. So that's 4 times 60%. Can you imagine the amount of damage numbers you are going to get up to when you and your Sentinel both affect the enemy with status? So your Exalted Blade is going to be doing fire and corrosive, just like your melee weapon, which I don't think we included fire with. But if, you know, push comes to shove and you're in-game content fighting sentience, then you're going to be using Exalted Blade anyways. So you're going to have your fire that procs it, your corrosive that procs it, the viral on the radiation. There isn't a whole lot in this game that can stand up to that type of damage. That type of, I've literally seen crits that were several times more destructive than red crits. I have an Amprex that does nothing but red crits, and the yellow crits I've seen with this are in the triple digits in terms of thousands. Like crazy numbers. Crazy numbers. You will see yellow crits that are higher than any red crit you've ever seen in the game. It's absurd, and all of that is brought to you via the effects of R-Tax and your Chromatic Blade. So, let's get into it. I've saved this discussion for last because I wanted to rant about it. I like the idea of Exalted weapons being separate from melee weapons or primary weapons. However, because they put them into the game the way that they have, this starts out completely empty and without a whole lot of polarity slots. I had to put 4 Forma into this. Now you can imagine that when you get Excalibur Umbra, you have to Forma him. You have to Forma the melee he comes with. You have to Forma the Exalted Blade. I started with 30 Forma before I got Excalibur Umbra, and now I'm down to 8. And I haven't even begun to touch my Valkyr, who also has an Exalted weapon. I haven't begun to touch my Avara or my Mesa. For people who collect pretty much all the Warframes, such as I do, that means that we are going to have to pump so much Forma into Exalted weapons, and that's literally the only thing wrong with this idea of making Exalted Blades a separate thing. I think that Digital Extremes should have given all of the community at least 4 Forma bundles of 3 in their inbox for free. Because if you're going to put in such a big update, which makes it so people have to lose a substantial amount of Forma, then the least you could do is give them Forma. But another interesting thing that another interesting question, I should say, that this brings to my acknowledgement is how Exalted Blade seems to be taking the place of a stance. That brings up a lot of questions, like, is Exalted Blade going to be able to have a Riven? Is Exalted Blade going to be alternative to something else later on down the road, like Exalted Saber, that turns your Exalted Blade into a two-handed giant sword? Will there be dual Exalted Blades? I mean, that's a good question, because one could surmise that because Teshin in the Conclave Relay, because he has dual Nakanas, I was thinking that it would be a safe assumption to surmise that Excalibur Umbra might come out with dual Exalted Blades. So it's interesting looking at this mod, thinking that there might be alternatives later on down the road, and I would also concur that I think that the Exalted weapons should be interchangeable. Wouldn't it be nice if we could put an Exalted Blade on Valkyr, or even Avara? I would love to put an Exalted Blade on Avara. As a matter of fact, I would love to just switch their Exalted weapons. I'd rather have Excalibur using the Artemis bow. That would be incredible to me. So I've wasted enough time ranting and discussing this. This weapon, or this Exalted Blade, came with its own unique mods, which is the Sacrifice Pressure and the Sacrifice Steel. And the set bonus enhances the mods in the set to level 2. I'm not exactly sure what that does, in my opinion. Like, in my opinion, I think that what it's going to do is increase the effectiveness of these mods together. But I don't know. I haven't play tested it too much. I just know that it replaces True Steel and it replaces Prime Pressure Point. Although these percentages aren't as high as these standalone mods, I think that they benefit from each other a whole lot more in the setup. So for the rest of the setup, I'm using Life Strike, because if I'm in an emergency situation and say I'm fighting high-level nullifiers that practically one-shot me, I'm gonna use Life Strike to deal one hit and replenish all of my health. So when you're in an Exalted Blade, just use your charged attack. You'll lose some energy, but that's no big deal. Hunter Adrenaline will replace your energy, but you'll get all your life back. So it's a win-win situation for everybody involved. Gladiator Might, it's interesting that you don't see the set bonuses here. I don't know why that is. I think Exalted weapons may take away set bonuses, but Gladiator Might is going to replace Organ Shatter for the 60% critical damage, and then Gladiator Vice is going to replace your Berserker for the 30% attack speed. Other than that, everything here is pretty self-explanatory. You have your Heat and Corrosive combination, as we discussed earlier. Now, in terms of secondary weapons, you can use anything that you wanted to, but if you're looking for a build for Hiku Prime, here it is. I'm using an amazing Riven mod, which does damage, multi-shot, and critical damage. Aside from that, very, very standard mods. Same thing can be said about Strun Wraith. You may notice that from the initial God builds for Excalibur to the ReForged, I switched from using Comb to Strun. I can assure you it's not because Comb was nerfed. Comb still does amazing damage. It's just I use that weapon for both my Vauban and my Saren Prime, and I feel like it would be very repetitive for me to continue to use it on Excalibur, so I opted to mix it up a bit and use Strun Wraith, which also has a Riven, amazing heat damage, reload speed, and status chance. Because the Riven is here, that means we can capitalize from heat and corrosive again, so that's going to again affect the condition overload. Very standard build here. If you didn't have this Riven, I'd probably go with Blaze, because you still want the heat damage and you want to boost your damage just a little bit more. That pretty much concludes my entire loadout for Excalibur. If you're not going to build this way, I would recommend that you build very, very similar to it. You do want to try to keep all of these mods in consideration here. Your condition overload, your chromatic blade, your radiant finish, your status, your growing power, all of this, the entire loadout is going to benefit from itself. whether you're using Stern Wraith, Broken War, or Exalted Blade, you're going to want to use a Sentinel that can apply additional status. I would not use a Kavat or a Kubro or a Helminth Charger for this particular loadout. I just wouldn't do it. I feel as though it's a waste. Link health and link shields, link armor, none of that is going to benefit from Excalibur as much as what it would from an Inaros or a Nidus. So don't bother using a companion. Go with a Sentinel, go with something that's tanky, that can, you know, handle a high tier fight. Go with Artax because it's the best status weapon for a Sentinel. You're going to need it to apply statuses to an enemy. That way you can benefit from the 4 times multiplier of the 60% damage increase. And with that, you will have an amazing Excalibur build that is practically undefeatable. I hope that you learned so much from this video, and if you did, it always helps if you smash that like button, comment, share to your friends, subscribe, and until next time, this has been Vance, signing out. Peace.